Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and today on our final episode of the season, we are speaking with Amy Jung, governance lead at Safe, and an OG in the Ethereum and specifically DAO space, about all things organizational design, governance, and her hottest takes about DAOs. Amy joined the Safe team back in March of this year and also has her own DAO operations and strategy consultancy called Shared Realities, where she helps organizations and teams with their progressive decentralization strategy and execution, organizational design, and community development. Previously, she worked at MakerDAO for 2 years as their head of community development and ConsenSys as their design operations lead. In this episode, Amy reveals many of her strategies and frameworks she uses to help organizations decentralize, starting with questions any organization should ask themselves to decide first and foremost whether it even makes sense for them to decentralize. I love the way Amy presents information in really clearly thought out frameworks that anyone can take back to their organization and implement, and her dedication to the space and deep expertise in DAOs and organizational design is clearly unmatched. Since this is our final episode of the season, please make sure you're following us on Twitter at RehashWeb3 or on Farcaster at Rehash, and join our community on Telegram at t.me/RehashWeb3 so you don't miss any updates about our upcoming guest election process and announcements about our upcoming season. All of our Season 8 episodes are now available for collect on pods at pods.media/rehash. Or if you'd like to get all of our episodes automatically delivered straight to your wallet, make sure you're subscribed to us on Hypersub, which is linked in the show notes below. Amy was nominated by Spencer Graham and voted onto the podcast by Spencer Graham, Aaron Soskin, Karsten, Hudson Jameson, Tim Black, and myself, Diana Chen. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Amy. This is Amy Jung. I should do a better introduction of you. I'm so glad to have you here on our final episode of the season. As our little season finale, we started Season 8 with Jonah Ehrlich from Den, who I'm sure they're using Safe very closely, very deeply. So it seems only fitting that we end the season with another conversation about kind of multi-party operations on chain and talking to somebody from Safe. It's like kind of serendipitous how this worked out. It wasn't planned or anything, but I love how it's worked out. So I guess just to go back to the beginning, could you give us kind of a really quick TLDR about all of the DAOs that you've managed over time, and just so we get a better idea of your background?
I came into the DAO space in a really weird way. Not that anyone came in like a really proper way. But when I was before crypto, I was running this community, and we were thinking about how do we give more ownership to the people who were contributing that. So actually at that time, we were looking for different models. We had this community, what we're going to do. We were how do we get resources? So we were actually thinking about it. And when crypto kind of came along, I was like, this makes a lot of sense. But that time, the concept of DAO was very, very nascent. Then I worked at ConsenSys, which is where I actually think it was a very early experimentation of what a DAO was. We had all these sub teams and they were very trying to be autonomous. There's resources, and I worked the design team there, and it was just really cool. And it just was a giant company, obviously. And we went through the 2018 highs and lows. And after that, I joined Maker on the community development side with Rich Brown, who was the head of community development at that time. And that was a really cool experience because I was there in the 2020 Black Thursday. I saw the community develop. And essentially when Rich Brown left, he handed me that role of head of community development, where at that moment was the catalyst moment for us to transition the foundation dissolution into DAO running itself and owning all these assets and everything that the foundation had grown. So it was the most extreme version of, I think, what people think about DAOs, which is why I think maybe people respect it, because it's just gone through a lot of processes. But it's so much different from the things I do now, where I help teams. I was consulting a lot with smaller teams on how do you actually design it from the ground up, taking the lessons we've done and not in an intentional way where the foundation is going to dissolve, but actually still give up a lot more ownership to different entities or distribute that from the beginning, which is very different than how, Maker started in 2015. That wasn't a concept then. So that's been really fun, just designing a lot of bootstrapping a DAO. How do you start the DAO? How do you think about how the DAO is going to run? And then recently, only in March, did I join Safe to work with Andre, who's the head of governance, and the team to just think about governance at Safe.
So when you think about organizational design in the context of a DAO, what are those main components that you think about? And I know each organization is so different. There's no playbook for DAOs. So I guess maybe do you have a framework of maybe questions that you like to ask each organization when you consult with them when they're thinking about decentralizing? Or how do you go about approaching this question of decentralizing, whether it's progressively or in some other way?
Yeah, actually, the answer to that is actually very simple. Having worked with multiple people, I've noticed that the foundations of the model is very simple. So there's sort of the MVP of DAOs that are if you're launching a DAO today, I think there's product, protocol, assets, and treasury, people. There's DAO operations and resource management. And then there's meta governance. What are the rules of the game? What is the organizational design and roles that exist? I think those are the fundamental key things. When I think about an organization, to me, they're I think of organizational design, it's more like designing the railroad tracks. So when you lay the tracks, you have no idea. There's no city that's built. Sometimes there are, and sometimes there's deserts of cities. And you're trying to get resources to that area, or you're trying to get people there, and because there's resources there or whatnot. And so it's about creating those railroad tracks so that people and resources kind of come together to get whatever they want to accomplish in this, let's say, city. When you have the MVP DAO, little protocol, product, assets, people, you essentially have the building blocks, and then it's the basics, which is so simple. It's kind of funny. It's just why do you want to decentralize? And there's a wide range of reasons. There's what do you want to govern? What does a DAO actually govern? There's who are the best types of people to help govern and execute that? And then what kind of information and resources do they need to do it? And then it's how do we ensure these people are accountable? And that's where governance comes in. So I think a lot of people think about designing governance from the beginning, but you really need to go through this process of defining what's the purpose of you doing this type of design. There's organizations that are centralized, right? So if you want to make a decentralized organization, you kind of have to ask why, and then kind of go through those processes.
Do you think there are right answers to that question and wrong answers? Because, back 2022, I want to say, when literally every single organization wanted to progressively decentralize. That was the buzzword. I don't know how many of them actually asked themselves that question, or, if the ones that did ask that question, would you say that there's a right answer where it's okay, yeah, that makes sense. You actually should decentralize, and a wrong answer where it's yeah, you're overthinking it. You're fine just the way you are.
In those two steps. So the first, why do you want to decentralize? I actually think I've kind of gathered that there's different reasons, and my personal opinion in this order is a good reason to less strong of a reason. The first one's value at scale. So for example, at Wikipedia, someone could make an encyclopedia, but there's something about contribution at scale that makes it a better situation, a better product, a better resource. And I think a lot of DeFi is the same, right? Coming up with strategies, DeFi strategies at scale can prove to be more effective than one person saying, this is what we're going to do. And so I think that's probably the strongest reason. Ethereum, even at large, I would say there's value at scale at multiple people coming up with ideas and developing them, right? Instead of Vitalik just sitting there coming up with one thing, which some people could argue they believe sometimes that is the truth. But then the second one I would say is Nathan Schneider's topic around sharing ownership with the people who value the platform. So sometimes there's a group of people, I talked about it with my community, who want to be part, they want to contribute more. They really think it's valuable. He always brought up the point around Twitter. Remember when everyone wanted to buy Twitter and there was this whole group of people coming together? That is a good signal of, yeah, maybe we should think about ownership at this kind of scale. The third one is probably the most popular and very valid. And I think a lot of DAO organizations are built on this, but regulatory compliance, it's like no secret. I know you had Catherine on it. A lot of it is just like, here are the constraints that we're working with, and we want to like create based on that. And then the last one, which I think is just weak. So when I kind of think about working with teams, I try to see if this is the reason, which is offensive and defensive mechanisms. So they might say like, oh, this team is doing it, so we need to do like a decentralized, like we need to build our product because of this competitive edge. And I think those tend to be the weakest because you're constantly like fighting a battle instead of focusing on what you're really good at. And so I wouldn't say there's a wrong one. That's just like how I've seen the strength of like decentralization. And then when I think of like, what does the DAO govern? I love this reference that Nadia, she used to be Iqbal, I think, but now it's like Aspera. Yeah, she changed her last name, but she has this book, Working in Public, and thinking, and she talks about this like, I put it into a matrix. It's contributors and users. And it's kind of this ratio between high level of contributors and high level of users. And she describes like 4 types. One, which is clubs. And these are like super niche libraries like AstroPython, which is just astrologists use this Python. And those are just like super niche groups where maybe there are very small amount of contributors, but they are like really active, the ones using it, but they're also really active in contributing to it because they really rely on it. Then there's a category of toys, which are like hackathon projects. So they're like, no one really uses them. Someone contributed. It's kind of like a fun thing. And sometimes you see these teams kind of like want to scale, but they're kind of like these smaller kind of like fun things. And then there's stadiums, which I think are quite popular. So like the Go Ethereum team is an example where a stadium, if you think about it, is like you have one core team kind of servicing a ton of like really large users. And so a small team that is contributing there, that's kind of like a stadium model. And then there's the idea of a federation, which is like Wikipedia, Linux, Ethereum, where there's a lot of users, but a lot of contributors as well, or people who want to contribute. And when I think about teams that want to progressively decentralize, I think stadiums that want to be federations are the best paths for that because they want to scale what they're doing versus like a hackathon, like a toy hackathon that wants to become a federation. They have to go through product market fit. They have to go through all these things that it will take them a while to grow into a federation. So that's kind of how I think about my model when I think what would help them be successful in their progressive decentralization. That being said, I'm always surprised. Like there's just things that happen all the time. I'm like, go for it. I'm glad you broke the model, you know?
Totally. Yeah, I think we saw a lot of that last thing. You said the offensive and defensive thing going on in the last DAO craze where everybody was kind of just jumping on the bandwagon, chasing a trend. And that's really like not what this is about. Would you say that, you know, when I'm hearing you talk about this, it sounds like DAOs are more fitting for larger teams that want to scale, that want to keep providing value, keep sharing ownership at scale. Would you say that there's sort of this like minimum threshold for an organization that you think actually makes sense to think about progressively decentralizing? Or do you think that smaller communities and smaller teams can benefit from decentralizing and becoming a DAO as well? And I ask this because like, again, in the last cycle, I think, you know, it sounds like back in 2019, it was those big teams and big organizations that were decentralizing and talking about DAOs, thinking about DAOs. But then in the previous cycle, anybody and everyone, you would have DAOs of like 3 people and, you know, they were calling themselves DAOs at least. How do you think about that?
I think my first principles around this landscape of like decentralized technology, what's so unique about, for example, like we have distributed technology. We have a lot of things that the internet, right? We have things that already exist. What's different from what's happening in Ethereum? I mostly focus on Ethereum. And I think to me, it's really comes down to like this idea of like this collaborative network effect. And so when I think, oh, what are the characteristics of that? There's a lot of like internet native behavior. So there's these network effects, autonomous execution in some form. So that could be you have a vote and then we, you know, execute based on that vote. It could be that literally, the client's fork, whatever it is. I think there is some kind of internet native thing that doesn't exist in the real world, but like in more of a different environment. I think there's a lot of like peer-to-peer regulation and organizing. And ultimately for me, I think about like multi-party ownership with these networks that can take them on. And I think ultimately like DAOs work so much better at scale because of the mechanisms we have. Like the number one thing I tell people when you launch a token is like, get ready. It's just going to be like massive, right? You're essentially just like going wide to a bunch of people that you don't really know. And that if you do that in a small scale, that can work as well. But I think if you really want the impact, that's what the DAO, I think that's what's driving DAO as a type of organization structure. That being said, the smaller ones could totally work. It's like, sometimes it's just like, do you need that kind of coordination, like mechanism for it? Maybe because maybe you don't know the people on the internet and you want to use it. Like I just don't think it works if you're like 5 friends, like trying to own a house and you're like, well, you kind of know each other. These are like social agreements. So that's how I think about and why I'm a big component of this scale aspect.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you think about it differently based on which space that organization occupies? So would you think about it differently if it was a DeFi protocol versus if it was more of like a content guild, for example?
I don't think it actually matters so much, like because like an investment one you could scale to large size, even a content one you can scale like from a small team to a large team. So I don't think that context matters as much as like what is the purpose, like what is it you guys are trying to achieve. And I don't think a lot of teams, like if we go back to like what I was saying, if your goal is to kind of like be value at scale, of course, then you want that. But if your goal is like, let's keep it to these 15 people, it doesn't matter what you're doing. Your plan is to keep it to this size. So to me, the context doesn't matter. I love seeing different versions of like groups that are non-DeFi. And that's a big reason I also joined Safe, because I was like, I don't want to work at something so focused on DeFi anymore. Like we've seen that iteration. What's the other thing that is going to prove that DAOs doesn't have to be DeFi?
Yeah. One question that I've been kind of mulling over for, I don't know, years, and I just like can't figure out is how to balance growth with quality. It seems like to me from what I've seen that the more growth you have, the more reduction in quality you have. And so if your goal, for example, is value add at scale, then you want people, as opposed to just like having people vote like yes or no on proposals. It's obviously that requires reading and thinking and, things like that. But I think it's a lot simpler to ask people to vote yes or no on a proposal that they've read and that's been written for them already versus asking people to actually contribute a piece of code or an idea for a DeFi protocol or a piece of content or something like that. From your experience, how have you seen, like what strategies do you have for maintaining that quality as you also grow and scale?
Yeah, no, it's totally, and I think that's actually the number one fear that teams have when decentralized. Because you're so used to working in this team, you know what everyone's going to do. There's a lot of like knowns. And then you go, okay, how would this random person that doesn't have context be able to give us high quality work? And I think in the end, high quality work is about information. Like, do you have the information and the resources you need to actually deliver this thing? So like there's teams like Ben from ScopeLab. He is incredible. Like they are a small team and they're super high quality. And I think they do really well. And in the end, it's like you can have teams outside of the core teams if you have the right pathways to knowledge share, making sure that the information goes directly to them. Like, why don't a lot of delegates vote? Because they don't simply feel like they have enough information. And then what these teams I see do is you create smaller groups. So you kind of like nestle a lot of smaller groups into it. Essentially, you have like multi-level groups made up of these smaller, higher quality, because I think it's in the end like information. The more nodes it takes to go out, you lose out more. So how do you actually maintain it, that quality in there? You try to keep it like very focused and then allow that group to like nestle into a larger group and then to a larger group and so on. Like, I think that's a more natural form of how we tend to work together.
Yeah, that reminds me of a question that BJ had on Twitter. He said, based on your experience, how do you think about making trade-offs between centralized and decentralized decision-making for protocols and DAOs?
Yeah, I mean, shout out to BJ, not BJ. In the end, it really still comes down to that why. Like, I find myself as like the accountable person in the team that says like, why are we trying to decentralize? If we don't have a good answer, it could just be that, oh, the technology doesn't make sense decentralized, which is why like this question around this product makes sense decentralized is like a really interesting question for me. But it could simply be like with engineering, maybe it doesn't make sense decentralized, but maybe there's layers of that stack that makes sense decentralized. L2, you've got sequencer fees, but there's like so many little pieces that you can give ownership, distribute that ownership. It doesn't mean you have to give ownership to a lot of things. And then you have these security councils, right? See, I'm not a decentralization maxi. So for me, I don't think of it as like, here's everything you have to decentralize. And the end of this game is decentralization. I do think there's a difference in having the value of decentralization at the core of your organization, which is what was Maker. And like, you really saw it, right? Like all the decisions around how Maker as a system doesn't work centralized. It is a decentralized system. The organization around it could be centralized, but the system in itself of how it works is decentralized. And that feeds a lot of the value, a lot of decision making that ripples out towards it. So I think of it like that. I think of like first, like the why, again, going back to the why. And then second, what's your roadmap to it? And it's okay that, you know, slice little part. That's why I like progressive decentralization. I think it's more manageable.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, that's a big mistake I think we saw a lot of DAOs making in the last cycle is making everything fully decentralized from the get-go and giving everyone, you know, governance power over everything. And it's like, not everyone should have governance power over everything because maybe not everything should even be decentralized to begin with. And B, like you said, you have to give people information so that they can contribute value in the right ways. And so it doesn't make sense necessarily all the time to give everybody governance power over everything because most people are not going to have information and context over every aspect of the organization. So like for us, like we allow our members to nominate and vote on our guest list because they're the people that listen to the podcast. And so they are best equipped to tell me who they want to hear on the podcast. But it might not make sense for me to like hand over the treasury to them, you know, if they have no context over like what we spend money on or how money comes in or anything like that. I think that context and that information is really important. I also wanted to ask too, as you were talking about having these little groups of teams within an organization, which, you know, helps provide more context to the people working on those things. How you think about separating people into little groups versus having that cross-functional ability, like how you balance that. This is a question that exists in traditional organizations as well, not just in DAOs. But I think in DAOs, it's like emphasized more because there isn't a clear leader all the time and there aren't clear procedures, like written procedures or anything. So how do you advise teams on that?
The like after effect is kind of like what structure works best for you. But when I take a step before that, related to what we were just talking about, I think of it as this like matrix where it's reversible and irreversible decisions, and then like high context and low context. And I think about things that fit into it, right? So like what would be irreversible in like high context? A lot of times like really secure code, right? It's like, it's really nuanced. You need to know a lot of things. It's innovative, etc. There's probably a very little amount of people who actually can make those decisions. Then you have, for example, reversible and sort of like low context, such as translating existing content. That's okay. You make a mistake, okay, we'll just fix that. Like it's not the end of the world. Then I think like rants, for example, is kind of in that middle where you're like, I'm going to set some milestones. I'm going to help you through some of the context for like what our organization needs. you do it, we do the milestones and so on. So I think first I try to map those types of like initiatives there. And then I think of like the organization currently, how does it currently function? And most of the time it's like pretty basic domains, right? So you have like a marketing, product, engineering, and so on. And these are just kind of company structures. They're very like siloed, and it's maybe you work on objectives together, but really like each team takes on each of these things. I think another interesting one that I think we are working towards is strategic objectives as like a way to organize around. So that's naturally cross-functional. I think there's like a Spotify SWOT framework around this, where essentially it's like, here is what we're trying to achieve. And engineering, tech, whatever, they all kind of come together to fulfill this objective. That is a different but more naturally cross-functional way. It might be harder for people who are in specific like marketing or product, for example, for them to level up in their marketing career or so on. So there's different trade-offs in that structure. And then there's the one that at Maker, we were trying to experiment with, which is this idea of the core units, or I think of atomic units. So it's a much more emergent way. Like, what if people with specific expertise come tell us what they see as a need, and then like develop an organization around that? So it's much more emergent, but you do fall into like the agent principle problem, which is kind of what we saw now. So we kind of saw like the trade-offs of that kind of structure. So I try to like find organizational solutions based on what the current structure is and where we're trying to get to, and like what would be the best formation based on what the team needs and so on. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of the different ways like I've been trying to iterate on those.
Compared to most of my friends in Web3, I'm not the most online person. And with how fast things move in this space, it can be really challenging to keep up with the newest projects and what's trending. That's why I love Forage, a community-curated front page for launches shaping on-chain culture. A Forage launch page combines a press release and a commemorative mint into a sleek single page where they garner support in the form of mint. Projects receiving more mints are bumped to the top of the page, which means I can finally stop doom scrolling or worrying about missing an important launch and simply check Forage to stay up to date on what's happening on-chain. And as an added bonus, Forage uses protocol rewards, so supporters receive a referral reward each time someone mints through their referral link. Go to forage.xyz to get started today. Yeah, no, it absolutely does. So I want to move on and talk about Safe. You've been at Safe for a few months now, leading governance there. What has the decentralization process for Safe looked like? And like, I'll be honest, I was a user of Gnosis Safe, from years ago, which is now Safe. I haven't followed along with the governance process very closely. I, in all transparency, delegated all of my tokens to Jonah from Den because I just trust that team so much. And I was like, you're deep into it. Like, you're paying attention to everything. I trust you. So I've kind of relinquished my own responsibilities on that front. But can you talk about like what that decentralization process has looked like for Safe so far?
Totally. And first of all, your experience is very common. Like that's okay. I think we all know like you don't have to be like involved in every single organization that gives you tokens. I came at a very interesting time of Safe. So I just joined in March. We just had what we call token transferability event in April. The interesting thing about Safe is that when it launched, the DAO launched with its token, with that concept of the DAO, it was like November, it was 2022. And since then, in the beginning, what happened was first, the unique thing about, there's like few unique features about when Safe launched. One, it split transferability with the launch of the token. So the token exists, but the token can't be transferred until the DAO decides it's going to be transferred. And now I think Eigenlayer also does this now, but separating these two things are very interesting because what we saw at Safe was right following that, there was a SCP-2, number 2, was make this transferable, and it didn't pass. It was really interesting. There was like a lot of discussion, and it was probably good timing at that time, but essentially there was a lot of discussion, and then the third SCP that came from it was like, why should it shouldn't be unlocked? You shouldn't be able to transfer it until these milestones are met. Because it was at a time like there was no constitution that was ratified. There was a constitution in motion, but it wasn't ratified. There was no resource allocation, like how the safe like treasury would be spent. There was like no concept of like how the token folds in with the utility. Like there was a list of things. So the thing that was voted on was there had to be these milestones before it could vote to be transferred. And that took a while. That took until this year in April, where we finished the milestones and then there was a vote for it to transfer. And what does that do on a governance level? First, when tokens can't be transferred, you're locked into whoever has the tokens at the moment. And so SAFE was good at distributing it. So it was also really interesting. If you think back to 2022, it was like still quite innovative then, giving ecosystem participants. There was like teams like Tally. There was teams that were engaged in the ecosystem that had contributed to SAFE in some way. And there was token allocations to those types of communities. And there was individuals, organizations, and so on. And so it was sort of distributed in that way. And then we also launched a Guardians program, which is a selection of people who would become like the guardians. And they actually have specific like responsibilities, like signaling if a proposal is ready to be voted on. So they're reviewing and saying, they're not like giving vouching, but they're just saying this fits the structure for it to vote. And so this idea of guardians, which actually is like also launched in the ZK Syncs, the ZK Nations one now, this concept of a guardian as well, not used in the same way, but the concept. These two combined gave us like a certain amount of holders, and we couldn't increase the amount of holders that could participate. That's a really like interesting like outcome of when you don't have transferability, you know? Treasury is kind of locked as well. And so it was like a lot of really interesting things, yet we had a lot of infrastructure. So there was a framework put in called OBRA, which at the time was also very popular. It's outcome-based resource allocation, which is that there's a vision, goals, and then there are strategies. So it's kind of back to the strategic objectives that I was talking about. Here are the strategies that the DAO wants to put buckets of money in, and then initiatives can apply. So that was like an example. So we were thinking about, we have Oprah, we have all these processes. Now me coming in and we're sort of rethinking, like we kind of are starting the DAO a little bit from fresh. You know, it's quite small, even though it's a really big project. How is this going to scale now? Because there's a lot of teams who build on SAFE, who are interested in contributing to SAFE. What kind of railroads do you have to build? And so that's what I'm working on internally around governance. Yeah.
Gotcha. Just to back up, for protocols or projects that separate the token launch from the transferability, what is like the reasoning for that, for doing it that way?
For some teams, it's legal. Like you might want to do that. So another thing is like giving ownership to the DAO. Like they do get to decide on this situation. And in this case with SAFE, like, you know, the DAO didn't feel like it was ready, which is really interesting. Like it's a really good signal. I don't know EigenLayer's reasoning behind it, but they did a little something differently, which is they put a date. They have a date in which it will be transferred.
So when you look at like the governance process at SAFE now, what are some things that you think are operating really well, you know, compared to other DAOs you've seen? And then what are things that you are hoping to improve on?
With SAFE, it's a really interesting experience because the foundation is the legal wrapper for the DAO. So it manages treasury. Like it doesn't manage it. It is just like executes on the signal from the DAO. So I think it's really good at, even at launch, there was a participation agreement at sort of like these legal protections for DAO members, kind of thinking about that very early compliance, paying taxes, so on. So I think SAFE has always been really safe in that matter, like very thinking about these things that a lot of the industry now is like thinking about, right? We don't know, like we have some processes that we want to fold in with the DAO. We're just figuring those processes out. And then I think what SAFE can improve on is one of our objectives for this quarter is like, how do we increase the amount of contributors that are like high quality and give them like the pathways to contribute or like take action? Because I don't think we have enough of those. So that's a main one that we're focusing on. And then the second one is like information asymmetry, making sure everyone has the information they need. How do we knowledge share from the core team to different teams outside of them? The DAO has quite a large treasury. It even has a joint treasury with Gnosis, but thinking about what's the best way for us to extend that and kind of work through that. So a lot of we've kind of narrowed those three things down into what we can improve on for this kind of coming year.
How do you think about each of those things? I think all three of those are really good questions. I think, I'd be curious to hear, what's your strategy with how to approach it with Safe?
I think with the retaining and kind of attracting and retaining the contributors, it's your classic community development strategies. I think what happened with Safe is there was a lot of momentum, and then as you said, oh man, you delegated, and then there's a lot of these new DAOs and stuff. And so that's kind of where we're working through. I'm really also looking forward to engineering. There's going to be more protocol and technical decentralization coming. So we're also trying to figure out how to break that up into how the DAO can how that transition could work a little bit more. So that's the information as asymmetry part. So we're actually starting to do some sessions where we're going to bring in more a smaller group to get feedback sessions and co-design a little bit, co-design with the experts that are in our ecosystem. We're designing that starting from ETC and so on. So yeah, we're very early stages of trying to work through these things. But yeah.
Yeah. How does Safe think about compensation models for incentivizing people to get involved? TLDR on your biggest learnings and thoughts on compensation. What would it be?
I think grants as a process, we've used grants to take on everything, right? We're there's grants for this, and it's kind of diluted the concept of what grants is. A grant is at least at Maker, it's you know what? We believe what you're going to do is going to contribute to the ecosystem, but we don't have an expectation of you giving that money back. That's different from when DAOs use grants as service provider agreements. You do this thing, and we expect you to do these things and so on. And I think that's very different. And so I think about, what do we expect X group of people to do? What would be the best compensation for them based on this expectation? So the guardians or delegates. And I think you kind of have to think about these groups differently back to that context matrix, right? If you're doing something that's really irreversible and really high context, that requires a lot more compensation because there's also a lot of liability than something that's a bit smaller. So I think thinking about them in different scales is helpful, just to kind of break it down a little bit. But yeah, some of the stuff I see in the industry is crazy. I don't know that that's a sustainable model.
Yeah, I've seen it on both ends of the spectrum. I've seen people just come in with loads of money, throwing money around like they're Oprah. And then I've seen other people who are and this is probably more commonly, is a lot of people essentially working for free for DAOs, at least for a while before they ever get compensated. And I think we saw that a lot in the last cycle too, is all these people were hearing about DAOs for the first time, really attracted to them for various reasons, the lack of a hierarchy, the flexibility of when you work and things like that. There's all these things that were attracted to people, but then they ended up working for so many DAOs for free and doing so much free work just to get their foot in the door and be able to actually be a core contributing member and earn something. What do you think is the best way to approach that? Is it to offer compensation up front? And I understand why some DAOs don't offer compensation up front. It's A, they're just starting out. They don't have compensation to offer. B, they don't know who you are, right? So there's a lot you could be an anonymous person on the internet. And so until you sort of prove out what you can do, it can be tough to offer, to know how much compensation to offer you. But what do you think is the best way for DAOs to approach this?
I kind of use two models combined. So I have this framework I think about contributors. It kind of goes back to your high quality, kind of concepts. So there's 4 types of personas. One, which is there's an individual who wants to work for the DAO part-time or full-time with capacity, and they are committed and they're focused on a certain area, and they're comfortable to lead that area. So it's I have risk management, I can I want to figure out how I can contribute in that way. Those are great because they become very natural leaders in the DAO. And those are ones you want to really nourish. And then the second persona is individuals who want to work for the DAO, but they kind of are a little bit, they're not comfortable leading. They kind of want to like suss it out a little bit. And I think these are kind of leaders in the making. It's really interesting because I came up with this framework a while ago and I wrote persona that maker, and it kind of came out to be true. Like the ones became like facilitators. Some of them joined a sub DAO and then they joined a core unit and then became leaders. Like it's really interesting how they kind of level up. They can level up in some ways. And then there's like the third one, which is like individuals who want to contribute like generally to the DAO, but they don't have a focus in an area. And I think that's where it can get really like questionable, because that's where I think about time. So the longer it takes for them to like get there, either because you guys have bad onboarding or maybe you have great onboarding and that person is just like not fully committed, the longer it takes, you kind of have to let those go, because those don't really work out long term. And you just spend a lot of resources and then they become kind of like mercenary. They're like, I'm here to like get my, money, and like I will just sit here and like do what is told. And that doesn't, especially in an early stage of a DAO, is not really helpful. Like you really need to like get those leaders, that can help give you vision and strategy. And then in the end, there's like the fourth type, which is kind of like these service providers who want to deploy like very specific things. And I think nowadays there's a lot more of those service providers than there were before that actually can do like very specific things. So they do it for all DAOs. So it's like very generic. If they have a solution that's faster because they have done it before, that's a different pricing model. So I think of like resources of like, yeah, let's nurture this group that, okay, let's start them out maybe a little under market value. And then when they rise to it, like immediately give it to them and don't wait for them to ask for it, because those natural leaders and the leaders in the making they're bad at asking for more. You have to like give them, like you'd be like, you need to take this money. And those are really great signals too, because they're not doing it for the money. Like there's reward, but they're not doing it for the money. I think what happens is if you don't do compensation, but you ask for things, then people want retro comp now. And every DAO I've been in is some discussion around retro comp. And it just kind of puts bad precedent. It's a bad signal for you. And then it's a bad precedent, because what about all the other people who eventually down the line, like, is it a one-time thing? Is it continue on? Like, you kind of have to either establish it as a system or you like don't do it, in my opinion, and reward them a different way,
Interesting. First of all, that's a really useful framework to have. And then secondly, so what do you think of like all the retro PGF programs that are out there? Like, do you think it's okay as long as they establish that as a program that people can apply for, and you don't do it on like Amy asked me for retro funding for all the work she's done, and so I'm gonna give it to her. And then it's like Spencer comes in and he's like, wait, I've heard Amy got money for stuff she did in the past. How about me? And like you don't want to do it more on a case by case basis.
That's an example of like, what's the outcome that you want out of retro PGF? It was, hey, we think that we can know in retrospect that this work was actually really impactful, and then we want to give you money. And in the beginning, it was like a surprise for people, where they're like, whoa, didn't expect this at all. Then what happens is the more you do that, you start to know as an organization what is actually impactful. So now you have on-chain, like if you look at the rounds now, how they're doing design, it's like very concrete, right? It's like, this is impactful for optimism. These are metrics that are impactful. So we're just going to directly fund these. And then it incentivizes teams to like work towards those metrics. Then the teams that are like, really early stage and bootstrapped and they need that money, I think, that's why OP has like a side program. Like if you need the grant funding a bit earlier, that's different. But to me, that's a grant. Like just do a separate grant for those teams. So I don't know, because I'm like curious how it plays out. But this is what I've seen with retro PGF. I think same situation in a smaller scale, like maybe in the beginning, you don't know your metrics. So this is a way for you to figure it out and invest in those people who are experimenting for you, essentially.
We had another question from BJ, and I've kind of asked the first half of it already, but his other question was, what does Safe intend to do differently with governance than other DAOs, and what have been the best examples and worst counterexamples of good governance that they're taking learnings from? So we've kind of talked about that first part already, but the second part about like some of the best examples, I know you shouted out Scope Lift as like someone who's doing it well. if you have other good examples, or, I don't know how much we want to shit on people that are not doing it so well, but if you don't want to call out names, maybe like just describe ways that they're not doing it well.
So one thing I really like about OP is that they say, okay, we're not fully decentralized. We're on our path to decentralization. Here is the roadmap. And you can like see the movements toward that roadmap. And I think if you're like a maxi, you're like, that is just not decentralization. Like, to me, it's like, okay, because I'm like, that is the path. So I use them as that kind of example. I think there's a lot of really exciting ones coming up. Like just the people, like Rafa is such brilliant. He's at CK Nation. There's really interesting stuff that's going to, I think, come out of Eigenlayer and that governance team with Track. Like so many different people that I just think are brilliant that are going to like, that I just follow. Like, I'm like, what are you doing? What are you thinking? How are you thinking about it? And I learned from their mistakes essentially. So they tell me what didn't work. And I'm like, cool, like that's a great lesson. Like, why didn't it work? For example, at Maker, my opinion of why people feel, it's kind of this like new, like the end game kind of doesn't work is because I think I'm very critical that like visionary, like I think so often DAOs get captured by the founder, like recaptured by the founder. And it's like, you put so much work to decentralize and you're like recentralizing this thing. Why? And I think the reason is because visionaries are really hard to find. It's like a very specific skill. I don't have that kind of like scalable vision. So I kind of don't know how decentralized vision could really work. But I look at a lot of those DAOs where like they've been recaptured by the founders. And I'm like, how do we make sure that doesn't happen? Like what kind of strategies? How do we ensure that there is innovation? Like these kind of things, that's what we think about and just kind of like watch a lot of. But yeah, I would say like Justine is so crazy at just like knowing every single thing, with her, the DAO like archives, which is incredible resource, like would highly recommend. You can just learn from like these patterns, I think it's not, I don't think there's one DAO that does everything well. And there's no one DAO that does everything bad. It's like pieces work. And then you need to figure out why it didn't work as like a key metric.
Question in the chat, which DAOs have been recaptured by the founders?
Oh my gosh. Okay. I mean, it's such a call out. I mean, I'm going to say, Maker, I think it has been recaptured. There was a moment, I think Kane from Synthetics was like recapturing and came back. That was really interesting. I think there was a time, very long time ago with Index, like very, very long time ago, where the founder like stepped back, came back in and so on. I mean, Aragon, wow, what a recapture of the foundation. There's like moments for sure. And it really tells you how like decentralized or centralized your system has become.
Yeah. What do you think about, I think it was Spencer that wrote the anti-capture framework. Are you a fan of that?
Yeah. Also just like a big fan of Spencer's work. Yeah.
We'll include that in the show notes as a resource for people. And then VJ, he's really into this episode. He had a lot of questions for us. But the last one I'm going to call out from VJ is, what is your spiciest hot take on the one thing that all DAOs are doing wrong?
Oh my God. Okay. Actually, I had a conversation with someone. This is very spicy. I am seeing something in the industry I just want to call out. I don't know why. It has just become a very competitive space again. So I really believe like the reason I'm here is that I think we could innovate through collaboration better than competition as an innovating factor. I'm here for collaboration. Like let's share the information, best practices. Like, yeah, it didn't work for my DAO, but it might work for yours. Great. Now you do something good and I use it. And it has now become very selective. Like people are taking teams, And I just spoke to a founder about this, and like, I think that's happening at a bigger scale. A lot of people like taking these kind of sides because the other team is like doing this and they want to be anti that, whatever. So I think that is not helpful for our industry. I don't think it's helpful for DAOs. I really don't want us to continue that path. So that's my hot take.
I love it. Well, the last question I ask every guest this season is to give me a can you not? And you've kind of just done that.
Yeah.
Can you not be all competitive and stuff? And can we all just like work together? But so totally fine if you want to use that as your can you not, but do you by chance have another can you not?
I think that's like the main one I've been really thinking about. Yeah. insane. Maybe like a can you not to the scammers? Can you just not? Like, can you just stop?
Just not?
It's just so annoying.
No, I know. There's
Stop scamming.
There's like a small DAO that I'm a part of that has been pretty stagnant for the last year or so. And it was a nounish DAO. And we had, we had maybe like 6 or 7 ETH in the treasury, like not much, but it was still like, it was not like nothing either. And because we've been stagnant for a little bit, a scammer came in and somehow managed to
Rug.
Yeah, and just stole our entire treasury. And I mean, obviously, a lot of that was our fault for not paying attention and for like letting it go inactive and not moving the funds elsewhere as we probably should have. But I then like spoke with other people, and I hear that it's a pretty big thing for scammers to go and find these inactive DAOs with some money in the treasury because they know the DAO's inactive and like people probably aren't paying attention. So it's easier for them to go in and pass these proposals and like get all the money stolen. So I'm with you on this. Can you just stop scamming? Like, it's not cool.
Stop scamming.
Get a real job.
Like, exactly. Yeah. You're smart. Just use it for something else. Like,
exactly.
Don't scam people. Just use it for something else.
Exactly. If you're smart enough to scam, you're smart enough to like get a job, like doing something good.
Yeah, white hat, like do something better. Yeah, redirection.
Yeah, redirection. Well, I think it's really telling that your Can You Not is this pretty much the same Can You Not that we've had on the previous 2 episodes. So clearly we're all seeing the same thing happening in the space, that people are getting a little too competitive. Can we not, like, the whole thing that is supposed to draw people into this space is like the open source, decentralized, collaborative nature of it. So can we not turn this space back into like a Web 2 Silicon Valley vibe again? Like, we've been there, done that. Let's just move on.
Kumbayas. We need to kumbaya a bit more. Let's gather in kumbaya.
Let's all get around a campfire and kumbaya a little bit more. I'm all for that. All right. So last thing, Amy, before you go, tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you personally. And then also feel free to plug away at anything safe related as well and how people can get more involved there.
I guess Twitter at it's Amy Jung, very like creative there. And I am trying to grow Farcaster. Like, I'm so bad at growing that. I need to like cast more. It's at Ames, AMES. And then you can just, like ping me anytime. And then with Safe, our forum, it's just forum.safe.global. You can come message me and just ask me about Safe. Like, I'm happy to sit down and go through things with you. Yeah, ping us. You can follow our updates at SafeGov governance. So you could just see when proposals are coming in and so on. You can use Den to get like notifications. There's many different ways, but and the wallet has some really great features recently, so check it out as well.
Amazing. We will link all of that in the show notes. I also just gave you a follow on Farcaster, and we'll tag you on Farcaster and get you some more follows, get you more involved. I've also been trying to dive more into the Farcaster ecosystem in the last few months, so I'm right there with you, and we will together rise to the top. Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to our final episode this season. Make sure you are following us everywhere so that you can get updates on what is going on next in our next guest selection process. Hopefully, Amy, you'll have some people that you'll bring onto the podcast next season as well. Pass it forward and keep bringing on awesome people onto the podcast. And we will see you again soon with another episode of Rehash. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Rehash. Rehash is hosted, produced, and edited by me, Diana Chen. Rehash is also supported by our community of NFT holders who curate our guest lineup each season. To get involved, head over to our website at rehashweb3.xyz and collect this episode as an NFT. Anyone who collects an episode becomes part of the Rehash community and will be able to nominate guests for future seasons. To learn more about how to become a guest on the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/podcast. And to learn more about sponsoring the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/sponsor. Finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at rehashweb3 or on Warpcast and Lens at Rehash, and join our community on Telegram at t.me/rehashweb3. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.